Jordan.
All right, we're taking you now live back to Capitol Hill as the first round of voting continues. To vote on a new House Speaker, Congressman Jim Jordan of Ohio has failed to attract most Republicans to his side. For the moment, let's just listen in and see who's voting for whom.
Jeffries. Menendez. Jeffries. Mang. Jeffries. Muser. Jordan. Mfume. Jeffries. Miller of Illinois. Jordan. Miller of Ohio. Jordan. Miller of West Virginia. Jordan. Miller Meeks. Jordan. Mills. Jordan. Molinaro. Jordan. Molinar. Jordan. Mooney. Jordan. Moore of Alabama. Jordan. Moore of Utah. Jordan. Moore of Wisconsin. Jeffries. Moran. Jordan. Morelli.
Mr. Jeffries.
Jeffries. Moskowitz. Jeffries. Moulton. Jeffries.
So this is what it sounds like when plans have to change. Congressman Jim Jordan of Ohio, the Republican, failing to attract enough votes to become the next House Speaker. Our congressional correspondents, Scott MacFarlane and Nikole Killion, are standing by. They're listening in. They've been speaking with all the key players here. Scott, let's start with you. I think we're counting 5 Republicans who voted for the former House Speaker and 2 Republicans voting for others who are not Jim Jordan. What does this all mean?
Yeah, Errol, on this first ballot, this is approaching the depths of drought that Kevin McCarthy had on his first ballot back in January. Every time that number ticks up in the other column, it becomes more work for Jim Jordan and his surrogates when they prepare for the second ballot. They didn't expect, as this floor vote opened today, that there'd be a first ballot victory, but the depths of the deficit are critical here. How much arm twisting is needed moving forward to convince some of those to come back to his camp? And there's such a fluidity to this. There's such a complicated dynamic at play, Harold, because it's hard to know, it's impossible to know how many people are voting for Jim Jordan who will change their vote after the first ballot, or how many are going a different direction who will change toward him after a first ballot. This is a type of logic that has fluidity to it, so it's difficult to corral. But there are some variables here, which raises the question rhetorically, will they go to a second ballot immediately? Will they spend some time trying to lobby an arm twist before doing so? That's what you're watching for as the final votes come in. How big does that number get in the other column? Because that could impact how fast they move to a second ballot and how uphill a climb it is for Jim Jordan.
And I think by now we're halfway through the alphabet. And as you indicated earlier, if there's early defections by Republicans away from Jim Jordan, it makes it easier for other Republicans down the line to also not vote for the Ohio congressman. What can he do in the meantime to convince Republicans to get behind him?
He's not doing this alone. I mean, he has got his Ohio delegation whipping pretty hard for him, and they have from the start. He's got a number of conservatives who've been with him since he founded the Freedom Caucus, whipping for him pretty hard. A lot of what they do, in a broad sense, is try to use the muscle of the conservative movement in America, the one that dominates talk radio, the one that can blow up your phone lines in a minute if they mobilize the rank and file. They can use them to call those 13 members who so far have voted for somebody besides Jim Jordan or Hakeem Jeffries. But in a more one-on-one way, the next speaker has an awful lot to offer, an awful lot of leverage, and those who want to make a play now to get something from Jim Jordan can go to him or wait for him to come to them and make their case. This is a pivotal moment as they approach and get ready for a second ballot.
Let's jump over now to Nikole Killion, who really peppered Congressman Jordan with questions this morning to gauge his confidence. Nikole, you mentioned that this first round was expected to fail for the Ohio congressman. What might be his plan B?
Well, his plan B is likely to ride this out as long as he can, or as long as he thinks he can muster enough support that gets him close enough to that magic number of 217, or in that ballpark. Though, based on this vote, he has a little bit of a ways to go. But, you know, look, in talking to him, he really tried to be upbeat and told me, you know, he hopes that he is the next speaker by the end of tonight. But that being said, you know, he really has been launching, I guess, retail politics, if you will, to try to win support, you know, and being outside of his office for the last couple of days. He has been shuttling between members' offices, making a lot of calls. I'm told today he was up extremely early, you know, trying to rally members ahead of this vote. And I asked him, you know, what he is doing, particularly to try to flip some of these holdouts. And his main message has been, you know, we need a speaker as soon as possible. It's time for us to come together. So that, in part, is part of what he's telling members. But the other part that I asked him about is whether he has threatened to primary members who don't support him.
Right.
Coming out of that Republican conference meeting last night, there were several members who said that they aren't going to be intimidated, and if someone wants to primary them, go right ahead. Now, Jordan denied doing that, but, you know, behind the scenes, we do know that there have been efforts, as Scott alluded to try to, you know, get members into line. And at the end of the day, if he wants the job, he really does have to try to pin people down. You know, at one point in time, you know, these members are going to have to commit one way or the other. So, again, this vote happening right now is kind of showing where people are along the spectrum, whether or not they hold that position or decide to change their vote remains to be seen. And I'm sure, though I don't know this, that, you know, there are likely conversations happening in the chamber, you know, in terms of aides who may be trying to, you know, try to get some of these holdouts to flip as this vote and these ballots continue to play out.
Nikole, I want to ask you about two items that would be characterized as baggage for the Ohio congressman. One being the Ohio State University wrestling scandal, sex scandal, former wrestlers accusing him of not doing enough to protect them when he was an assistant coach back in the 80s and 90s. Also, the argument that Jim Jordan doesn't have close relationships with Republican leadership on Capitol Hill. To what extent do those items hold him back?
Yeah, well, I would say he has a pretty decent relationship with former Speaker Kevin McCarthy in terms of leadership, who did, you know, obviously elevate him as far as, you know, the Judiciary Committee is concerned. And also, I mean, he's playing a lead role in this impeachment inquiry that was recently launched by House Republicans. So he has kind of been one of those players who's been out front and center. But that being said, you know, this scandal involving Ohio State and this wrestling situation, you know, this is something that dates back a number of years. You know, Jordan, whenever he's asked about it, always denies knowing anything about the allegations. But it is something that is of concern should he be elected speaker, and I'm sure something that will continue to draw more scrutiny. You know, I think the other big question is the role he potentially played with respect to January 6th and the 2020 election. He certainly was one of many Republicans who objected and voted not to certify some of the results. Of course, he was out front for the former president pretty vocally in the wake of the 2020 election, in some instances pushing some of the lies that the former president was putting out there, and attending rallies and events to try to drum up support for the former president. You know, what Jordan has said about that is that, you know, he doesn't think that the election was stolen, but that he did have questions that he thought was worth exploring. He also has said, that there were some concerns about changes that some states had made to their election laws, and he had valid questions about that. So that's kind of how he has explained his positioning around the 2020 election, but it has drawn the ire of many Democrats, as you heard Pete Aguilar, a former select committee member, acknowledge on the floor. And also, just yesterday, we saw former Metropolitan Police Officer Michael Fanone come out with a very strongly worded statement. Obviously, he was one who was beaten during the riot and called Jordan not only an insurrectionist, but an election denier. So there are very strong feelings about what role he may have played. Even former Congresswoman Liz Cheney has also suggested that, Jordan may have had inside knowledge about what might have been planned, that he was in close contact with the former president around the time of January 6th. So, there are still a lot of questions about his role that he has tried to tamp down, but again, whether or not that's enough to deny him the speaker's gavel, again, remains to be seen.
Right, and if he can do enough to convince Republicans reluctant to support him to change their minds. Nikole Killion there for us on Capitol Hill. Let's jump over to Scott MacFarlane if he's still connected with us, because Scott, as Nikole discusses the January 6th baggage, if you could speak about it politically, you've been steeped in those trials. Help us further understand the extent to which Jim Jordan played a role.
He wasn't just a congressman who was mentioned by the January 6th Select Committee. He was a focus of that committee. They made it unequivocal in their final report that they believe Jim Jordan was a leading voice of election denialism between November 3rd, 2020 and January 6th, 2021. And just today, one of the members of the January 6th Select Committee was circulating a 91-page dossier of social media and cable media statements by Jim Jordan after the election in which he fueled and disseminated baseless election claims. For Democrats, this is a visceral issue with Jim Jordan because they tie him to January 6th and the horrors of that day. But when you look deeper at the list of those 15 who so far have voted for somebody else inside the Republican conference, some of it is expected politically. You're talking about 4 members so far of the Republican conference from suburban New York City, some of whom flipped blue districts to red in 2022 and are running in districts that supported President Biden in 2020. But there are some others that jump out. The chairwoman of the House Appropriations Committee, Kay Granger of Texas, didn't vote for Jim Jordan. She has outsized sway because she chairs arguably the most powerful committee, and she also has oversight over spending, averting government shutdowns, approving aid to Ukraine and Israel. Her vote is striking and noteworthy. You have members from California, from Virginia, another one of those members who turned a blue district red, Jen Kiggins, who, oh, by the way, defeated a member of the House Select January 6th Committee to win her office. She's voted another way. But the second ballot is going to be a unique experience because we don't know how many folks voted for Jim Jordan this time and are willing to jump on the second ballot, or those who will do the inverse. And we're also waiting on some who didn't vote the first time round. Ken Buck of Colorado, John James in the Purple District in Michigan. They're going to go back to those individuals after they wrap up the first run through the alphabet. This margin could narrow, or this margin could widen, Errol.
And Scott, when might we expect the second vote?
Of Florida.
Asked that question of the chairwoman of the House Energy Committee, Republican McMorris Rodgers of Washington State. She kind of shrugged when we asked the question. They could move right on, roll right into the second ballot. That's what Kevin McCarthy did in January. Or they could take a recess in honor of the hour of the day for school children, an indefinite recess to figure out if Jim Jordan can move votes and his surrogates can move votes with time and privacy. We're about to find out, though, because this margin so far is potentially bigger than some of Jordan's surrogates expected when they talked to us this morning. And it means each member of that other category can be worked, but needs to be worked to move.
Yeah, Scott and Nikole, I'm certain you're both wearing comfortable shoes. It appears that it's going to be another long day. You know, some of what we can understand and extrapolate from this moment is through congressmen and women's body language at this moment. We know Jim Jordan has already failed, but let's continue to listen in as the last few votes roll in.
Scalise. Yakum. Jordan. Zinke.
James Daniel Jordan of Ohio.
Jordan.
Let's switch pens. All right, so I have 199 to 211.
All right, you're watching there. House of Representatives staff tally and confirm the votes after all 432 members make their choice for the next Speaker of the House. And they've got more work to do. Congressman Jim Jordan of Ohio, who came into this vote seeming confident in front of our Nikole Killion anyway, has failed to attract enough votes to become the next House Speaker. Let's listen on when the next vote.
The ring clerk will now call the names of the members who did not answer the first call of the roll.
Bilirakis. Bilirakis. Buck. Emmer.
Cardenas.
Cardenas. Jeffries.
All right, let me get to another one on that one. We have Mr. James.
James. Cole.
We have Mr. Joyce of Ohio.
Joyce of Ohio. Jordan. LaMalfa. McCarthy.
All right, Sparks is next.
Sparts. Massey.
All right, so you want to see. All right, so we have 212 to 200, and then we have 6 for McCarthy, we have 3 for Zeldin, we have 7 for Scalise, we have 1 for Mike Garcia of California, 1 for Emma, 1 for
All right, and that is how the first round of voting ends. Congressman Jim Jordan of Ohio attracting only 200 votes from his fellow Republicans. He needed 217. And so you not only had 17 Republicans who chose Kevin McCarthy, Steve Scalise, and some other Republicans as House Speaker, but there were some other votes there as well. As you see, the votes that didn't head toward Jordan or Jeffries jumped up to 20. Our Nikole Killion tells us Jim Jordan didn't expect to win this first round, but the key question becomes, what happens next? Who's speaking to whom in the room? Who is negotiating? Who can be convinced to support House Speaker McCarthy? Our Scott MacFarlane is there as well, watching all of this come in. Scott, what do we make of the Republicans who voted for Steve Scalise? There's Garcia, Zeldin, who's not serving in Congress. What does that mean? And I see Kevin McCarthy now speaking with, I believe, Jim Jordan and others. What do you make of it?
Yeah, some of these were expected, Errol. Let's be clear. These New York Republicans, these California Republicans who operate in very blue or purple districts, this Michigan Republican, John James, these are people who won districts that either narrowly went for Joe Biden, not so narrowly went for Joe Biden, or are close calls. The political complexion of their districts makes this an acceptable, if not a necessary vote, at least on the first ballot. I'm really underscoring those with ties to military spending who voted a different way. Congresswoman Granger, we talked about her, chairs the House Appropriations Committee, oversees the House's approval of all federal spending, including on the military, including on foreign aid. She went a different way. She kept her powder dry over the past few days over how she'd vote. And Jen Kiggins, in the Tidewater area of Virginia, an area of America that is simply defined by the U.S. Navy. You can't run in that district or win in that district without being a strong advocate for the military. In fact, Jen Kiggins is a Navy veteran. This is one of the broader issues, isn't it? What's this Congress going to do once the Speaker is elected in terms of funding Ukraine, funding the U.S. military, now funding for Israel? That's going to be the touchstone issue. And you've got two members who kept their votes secret till the last minute, till they actually issued the votes, who have ties to the military and voted a different way. As the second ballot begins, when the second ballot begins, well, that 20 number is critical. If that goes higher, if that ticks higher in the second ballot, this may have to go in a different direction for the Republican conference. But if Jim Jordan can make progress, chip away at it, as Kevin McCarthy did after several rounds, they may just string these together until somebody gets exhausted, somebody's mind changed, or somebody cuts a deal, and 217 becomes possible.
And Scott, just as I was coming to you, we saw former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy speaking with Jim Jordan and others. What are they likely talking about?
Well, this is a bit of a whip team, as we call it in Washington, D.C. A team of surrogates, a team of salespeople to help you make your case to others. There are different relationships that have different levels of strength in the U.S. House. So you bring the home state people to work on defectors from that state. You bring people from certain committees around if they've got defectors on their committees. You know where the alliances and the allegiances are, so you apply pressure where you can. Obviously, Kevin McCarthy had a loyal base of supporters. He lost the speakership, but he had the votes of 200 plus of his members. He could exert some influence with some of those who are defectors right now. But the timing becomes critical. How soon do they go to a second round? And in that short or long period of time, whose mind can be changed? Are these people who are voting for others, Errol, are they communicating implicitly or outwardly that they're willing to have their minds changed if somebody does X, Y, or Z for them? That's where the negotiations begin.
Scott MacFarlane there on Capitol Hill. Nikole Killion also listening and watching all of this unfold as Jim Jordan, along with former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and this whip team, try to figure out what to do next after failing on the first round to elect Jim Jordan as the next House Speaker. Nikole, what do you make of kind of what we're seeing on the floor of who's speaking to one another and what Jim Jordan now needs to do when we see so many Republicans choosing not to support him?
Well, I think first we have to remember all is not lost for Jim Jordan. I mean, at the end of the day right now, he's got about 200 votes. I mean, if you think back to Kevin McCarthy and that speaker's battle, I mean, in those initial rounds, that's about where he was hitting too. So again, and also I think you have to keep in mind that when they held this secret ballot last week where Jordan emerged as the speaker designate, initially he got 124 members to back him. Then that number bumped up to 152. So he has made some gains from 152. Now we see 200. At the end of the day, we're looking at, 20 potential members who did not vote for him, which is not an insurmountable task. I mean, it's possible, to Scott's point, he might be able to chip away at that number. That's much different than trying to chip away at potentially 50-plus members who are opposing you. So my sense is that Jordan will likely continue to ride this out because that's kind of what he conveyed earlier as he entered the chamber. I don't know that he wants it to be as exhaustive as what we saw with Kevin McCarthy because he does feel that there is an urgency here that a speaker needs to be in place. So, we will have to see again if they decide to move immediately to this second ballot. But my sense again is that for Jordan, this is not insurmountable to try to chip away at this block of Republicans. We understand that the whip, Tom Emmer, whose name was also brought up by one member, has also kind of been in conversations there on the House floor, likely trying to check in with members to see whether or not they can be persuaded. So those are likely the kinds of conversations that are happening on the floor as we speak.
And as you speak, Nikole, we can see former Republican House Speaker Kevin McCarthy there at the center of the room in the chamber. I saw Jim Jordan kind of coming down the aisle. I don't think he left the room. He may still be in there.
And keep in mind, I think with Kevin McCarthy, I think, as he entered the chamber this afternoon, he said that he told, those who are holding out that they should back Jim Jordan. I mean, we saw roughly 6 members express and vote for Kevin McCarthy, but he has already said, look, don't vote for me. I'm not in this thing. So that is a message that he has conveyed to some of these loyalists. And as we discussed, some of this is just, at least for this first round, perhaps allowing members that cover to vote for who they truly want. But as we move deeper into this process, they are going to have to make a decision about whether they're going to stand their ground or potentially cave.
Yes, very good point. Nikole Killion watching this all unfold live with us. Scott MacFarlane also there. As we wait to find out when the next vote will be, Scott, who's in charge of that decision and what will it tell us about the confidence level Jim Jordan has that he can convince these last few holdouts to flip?
And we just asked that question of Carlos Jimenez, the congressman who voted for Kevin McCarthy on the floor, and he says we're not sure right now when the next vote's going to begin. Ultimately, that's going to be in the hands of Jim Jordan and the Speaker Pro Tem, Patrick McHenry. We expect Congressman Jimenez to come over to our position here in a moment, and we'll speak to him live as we get a sense of what's to happen next and what's happening on the floor. But that idleness you see there, it's indicative of something. I mean, ultimately, members are having conversations about, what happens next and how to change the trajectory. Nobody was enjoying the 15-round intransigent fight that happened in January, and they want to see a breakthrough sooner than later. But to be clear, this is so symmetrical to what we saw in January. Numbers seem almost identical to what Kevin McCarthy had on his first ballot. And he showed a pathway to turn that into victory through discussions, informal and formal, through negotiations, and through continuing with the process, banging out round by round. This is all the indications and all the hallmarks of a multi-round fight, and we just watched round 1, Errol.
If there are reluctant... I want to listen now to what the next stage may be.
Okay. It's a 2-shot.
The tellers agree in their tallies that the total number of votes cast is 432, of which the Honorable Jim Jordan of the state of Ohio has received 200 votes. The Honorable Hakeem Jeffries of the state of New York has received 212 votes. The Honorable Kevin McCarthy of the state of California has received 6 votes. Lee Zeldin of the state of New York has received 3. The Honorable Steve Scalise of the state of Louisiana has received 7. The Honorable Mike Garcia of the state of California has received 1. The Honorable Tom Emmer of the state of Minnesota has received 1. The Honorable Tom Cole of the state of Oklahoma has received 1. The Honorable Thomas Massey of the state of Kentucky has received 1. No person having received a majority of the whole number of votes cast by surname a speaker has not been elected. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the chair declares the House in recess subject to the call of the chair.
Well, that tells you all you need to know about when the next vote will be. The House of Representatives failing on their first round of voting to elect a new Speaker of the House. Republican Jim Jordan of Ohio, who came into this vote this morning seeming to be confident in front of our Nikole Killion, has only attracted 200 votes, which is actually fewer than his Democratic opponent, Hakeem Jeffries, attracting all of the Democrats 212 votes. As we heard there, Republicans just weren't swayed by Jim Jordan so far, and as such have decided to cast their votes for the former House Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, for Steve Scalise, who withdrew his name from consideration just a few days ago because he said he couldn't attract the 217 needed to become the next House Speaker. And a number of other Republicans also nominated what seems as a protest vote away from Jim Jordan. Our Scott MacFarlane and Nikole Killion watched this all unfold live, telling us that there was no expectation that Jim Jordan would win the first round, but the question now becomes, when might he win? How many more rounds will it take? And we didn't get any clarity in the announcement that was just made as to when the next vote will be. Surely Republicans will need to get together, the former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, the Republican Jim Jordan from Ohio, to whip members into shape and into place and see what they can negotiate. We will continue to watch this live and bring you updates as they become available all afternoon here on CBS News. Stay right where you are. The day's biggest stories are coming up next, including President Biden preparing for her historic-making trip to the Middle East as the crisis between Israel and Hamas continues. Stay right where you are. More after this.